Hi, my name is Bernard Laurendeau, managing partner at Laurendeau and Associates and founder at Incopa Lab.
Welcome to the African Tech Roundup, Bernard.
Thanks for having me, Andile.
You went with two different pronunciations of your surname in that intro. What does that say about the world you inhabit in terms of obviously Laurendeau, if I'm even saying that correctly, being a French surname? The way you said it prior gives me the sense that you have a history with the US. But then we are also starting this call with the two of us being very, very far apart, me in the UK and you being in Japan. Yeah. So
Correct.
do with that what you will.
First of all, it's great to reconnect with you after a certain amount of years. I think last time we met was when we were in Silicon Valley or San Francisco, somewhere in that neck of the hood. But yeah, so I think since then I founded a management consulting firm based out of San Francisco. And what we do is really help decision makers in emerging economies, mostly Africa and then East Africa. But now this year we're expanding to other sub-Saharan African countries as well as Egypt. But really helping them on strategy and operations. And really, we're in the business of execution. So again, at the intersection of strategy, operations, and digital, and making sure that decision makers are enabled with execution horsepower. So what does it mean? It could mean setting up a project management office. It could mean setting up the right types of policies if they're a government type of client. So the idea is really to provide that project management, project leadership horsepower. Recently, we launched a kind of an extension of our services, but more specifically to help Japanese clients, Japanese organizations, as they enter what is for them really completely new types of territories, namely Africa, when they go to a certain amount of African countries. There's already a certain amount of Japanese presence, but a lot of them get lost in translation. And it's a bit difficult for them to navigate between not just the policies, the laws, but even the intercultural management aspect, and more importantly, the data aspect. So we help them on all those different aspects.
It is sobering to consider that we're having a conversation about discovering Africa as a market in 2025. And we'll go into that a little more later. But it just occurred to me that the last time we actually saw each other in person, you and I weren't on stage at the same time, but we were on stage at different times at the same conference in Addis. And you were at the time, if I recall well, moderating a panel of leading mobile telco players, including Safaricom, who were on stage at the time before they'd actually landed their license to operate in Ethiopia. And so That's another interesting thread there because you have an Ethiopian heritage. And so before we get into like Japan, and I really want to hear what it's like to be serving this mandate you just described out of Tokyo and being a bridge to the continent, give someone who has zero context about who you are as a person some backstory to help explain how you would have ended up in Silicon Valley to begin with, what it is that would have seen you and I meet in Silicon Valley first and then in Ethiopia next. How is it that you have a French surname?
Yeah.
There's just so much about you that I think will intrigue the listener at this point.
Yeah. So let me unpack that a little bit. So my dad is from the west part of France. He recently passed away, but he's really from, he had a good life, 93 years old. So, but thanks. So I was from the west part of France and met my mom, who's Ethiopian. I was born and raised in Ethiopia, as you know, the best country on earth.
The best food,
all of us
maybe.
know that.
In fact, hands down, my favorite African cuisine. But the rest, you'll have to debate because Zimbabwe rocks. So carry on, as you were.
But yeah, so it requires a bit of humility. But then I moved to France after high school. I went to prep school in France, in Paris, then engineering school in Brest, and then in the west part of France, and then ended up in Atlanta, Georgia. Need to say it with a southern accent. And that's where I got my aerospace degree, then my business degree. And After I graduated, I literally looked at the map and tried to identify where it wasn't too cold nor too hot, and then thought, and also not just physically, but also even economically. At the time, it was the recession. It was around 2008. And yeah, the Silicon Valley, the whole Bay Area basically was a bit recession proof. So not too cold, even from an economic standpoint, but really reminded me also of where I was born and raised in terms of, maybe not the altitude, but at least, the very mild
Yeah,
temperatures
the
and
climate
the
certainly has
winters. Yeah, yeah,
some
it's
similarity
amazing.
to
People think of Africa as really like everywhere it's 45 degrees and humid, and well, some parts are like that. Some parts, you may have winters like you'd see in Tokyo, and then you come to Ethiopia and you have a very nice temperature all year round, a rainy season, dry season. Anyway, Africa, and we'll, I guess, talk about it later, is really different from one country to another, not just the cultures, but even the temperatures, the climate, and everything. But yeah, so, I did most of my career there in the US in management consulting. Also worked in banking for a bit. And
So
then at
never
some
went into
point,
the aerospace stuff, the engineering stuff. Never, took
no,
your
in the
interest post
French
university.
system, they always push you to go into math and physics to the point where you realize at some point, wow, do I really like this?
Am
And
I trying to get to
uh,
space? Seriously, like, am I?
yeah, and then at some point you realize, for some people it's all good and they really enjoy it and really want to take it further in their professional life. But in my case, it wasn't really something that I enjoyed as much. Plus, it was a bit difficult also from a practical standpoint to get a security clearance, green card right away in the US to work in the aerospace field. So that also played a part, right? To for me not to get into that sector is because it's a bit tough, right? Aerospace is a bit of a tough sector to get into from a security clearance standpoint, which is completely makes sense, right? I mean,
It's kind of like a
Airbus does
backhanded
the same
blessing
thing.
for you, right? Because
Yeah,
at least
yeah,
that's something
exactly.
an African parent will be like, he tried.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but then, I could have stayed in the US and, collected my 401k and worked my way up the ladder, the corporate ladder. But, it was a bit always something inside of me. It's not like I was driving down 101 and all of a sudden I had an epiphany and, oh, now you need to go back to the motherland and none of that. But, there's always been something in me saying, we need to do something in Africa, in Ethiopia. And so at the time when we met, I guess I was working with Genesis, Silicon Valley based firm working on big data analytics. And that's actually how I discovered a lot of African countries at the time. I was regional director for Africa, so I got to see and visit many African countries. But then, yeah, I started my own firm and did what I call govpreneurship, right? I think, not that I'm trying to compare myself with Elon Musk, but I think that's what Elon Musk is also doing right now. It's kind of an internship for him into the government right
He's
after
like
he's
trying to
been.
decide if he wants to be a senator or a governor
Yeah,
someplace.
yeah. But I think, I actually call on all diasporans living from the African continent, living abroad to, in some cases, you can do things remotely. But I also, for those who can, right? For those who can, because I know it's not easy, to really try to do some govpreneurship. Because I think a lot of our leaders on the African continent, and I really mean it, I think on most of the African countries, they're lonely leaders. They have very little amount of support, right? The media wants to portray them as a bunch of corrupt leaders, or their pockets are full and they're just sucking the blood out of, the people that, but
Unsuspecting
that
citizens.
that's just one out of 100, and there's always a bad apple anywhere you go, right? It could be New York, it could be Chicago, as we know, there's a lot of corruption. But, so it's not like we have monopoly of sin in Africa and we're all sinners and everyone else around the world is a saint. No, so sin is equally distributed, and so a lot of the leaders in Africa turned out to be, very authentic, very genuine about what they're trying to do for their country, but they're lonely. And so, govpreneurship is, again, something that if you have ideas, if you think of something that, wow, I've seen this, I've done this somewhere else in the world, and now let me try to bring it to my country. I think there is that space with the leaders in Africa because number one, they're lonely, but number two, also they're usually welcoming and they have their own hospitality, and they will give you that space to really create programs, stand-up projects, even maybe build an institution, because we really, really need to build institutions, strong projects on our continent, because what we have under the soil is fine. I mean, it's very important. What we have in our brains is much more important. All the youth, their talent, their skills, their brains in general is something really, really important. But we need also leaders. We need institutions to drive these youth into something that makes sense to build an economy. So that's actually what I did. At some point is I kind of
Is that where I
helped.
found, is that where we connected? Because I remember you were actually embedded with the banking industry lobby that was looking to ensure that the entree of Safaricom into Ethiopia, no doubt headlined by a desire to ensure that M-Pesa grows their footprint in what is Africa's second most populous country. At the time, I remember understanding part of what you were doing was to ensure that the interests of that legacy cohort was represented sufficiently as that new player in the industry, disruptor, quote unquote, came on board. Is that the sort of thing you have in mind when you talk about this? Or is govpreneurship, the way you're describing it, really more something you do interfacing with government specifically?
Basically, at some point, I was senior advisor to the Commissioner for the Jobs Creation Commission under the Prime Minister's office. I was really embedded there, and really, I mean, we worked on a number of things, including the Startup Act, which unfortunately never seen the light of day ever since, but we worked really hard actually on the strategy and many, many other things. And I'm not going to get into the details of why it hasn't really been ratified just yet, but we also with my firm proposed a lot of things around digital entrepreneurship, a movement for entrepreneurship that we called NCOPA at the time, that we are continuing with a number of things, standing up associations. So truly being embedded, I think, in the government and really helping the decision makers, I think, is something that, I would really call on some of the diasporas to come back to their respective countries and do, right? Because this is very important. Now, for the banking aspect, Andile, I think what you were referring to was, because I've invested about 5 years ago, even before Ethiopia had a policy around a non-bank financial institution. We made this investment on a startup that at the time it was really just a message in a bottle and hoping that the policies would change. But then, I think when we met, Safaricom was about to come. They didn't even had their license just yet as a telco company. So and it was around the time that we also, as Arif Bey, got the license.
That's right.
And then a bit later, I became the CEO. But I've been very adamant about also, and this is something that I do sometimes lectures on for different entrepreneurship programs on the continent, is what I call fin sovereignty. Because, I think our African countries, all of them, really need to get their financial services sovereignty back. Some of them have gave it away. Some of them are still kind of, they don't really know what they're doing with it, or they're sometimes oblivious to whether they've given it away or not. And I think some, like Ethiopia, have done a good job at kind of retaining the basics of that sovereignty, but it can always slip away as well. And
it's all coming back to me, Bernard, because there was always what you were doing with respect to effectively serving as a trusted advisor to policymakers and basically government decision makers. And then there was what you were doing as an angel come sort of VC backing startup innovation in Africa alongside everything you were doing. And I remember RFPay specifically. And what I think was fascinating to me at the time was recognizing how what was a disruptive proposition in RFPay in the face of an incoming Safaricom wielding M-Pesa. There was this really interesting alignment in incentives between the incumbent banking industry and RFPay, which was definitely more the innovative startup, to
Yeah.
ensure that as Safaricom, Vodafone effectively came in, there wouldn't be what you've described, a whitewash takeover of market share as far as the mobile money opportunity in
Mhm.
Ethiopia. And I wonder how, in reflection now, you would say that has gone as far as a lobby, as far as a commercial interest you have in something like RFPay and its partners in more traditional banking, making that case now that you have the benefit of hindsight in how things
Mhm.
have unfolded post Safaricom entering the market.
I still stand by those tenets around financial services sovereignty. And I think Ethiopia has done a good job to a certain extent and making sure that we don't lose ground and making sure that there is a technology transfer, knowledge transfer, and that we're really building institutions. And so I think that is happening, but there's obviously some caveats because sometimes also when you do it maybe too much, now you're kind of stifling innovation and it's not a level playing field. In my personal life, I like to break habits, and you know that usually in literature, at least, what's usually you build a habit after doing it for 7 or 8 times. And in some cases, for instance, for a route, it's after 2 days. But I think sometimes some of these institutions, after they've built that habit of completely dominating, stifling, or maybe bullying, they're oblivious to the fact that they're suffocating, other entities. And so, unless and until people that are playing in that sector raise their voices, if they have a voice, but and then they need to scream, not just to murmur, right? And until they do that, definitely those habits will never be broken. And so I think there's still some of those very bad habits out there in terms of stifling innovation, whether it's, again, done because of habits or it's intentional. The end result is that yeah, it hasn't been a super level playing field, and it's been difficult for the private sector to actually innovate and do a few things. So I think overall, from a national standpoint, yeah, the banking sector has been able to kind of protect itself, but the incumbent telco has actually taken a bit too much. And it's not just, we really appreciate Ethiopian Airlines, for instance, as, national flagship carrier, and it's amazing the work that they do. You may have heard that now they're going to expand. They got the financing now from the FDB, and they're going to start the construction very soon for this massive airport out in the outskirts of
Can't
Addis
wait.
Ababa.
I
So
mean, it's
yeah,
not my favorite hub to fly through. And so, yes, that's definitely music to my ears. But also,
yeah.
isn't there was a deal with Rwanda Air as well? I think
Yeah, I mean, they have joint ventures a
joint
bit all
ventures and
over the
stuff. Yeah.
continent. And in some cases in Nigeria, it didn't go too well. In some countries,
I
it's
think
going very well.
I think they were trying to buy Kenya Airways. National pride prevailed from that deal going through, I think, if I recall.
Yeah, even in Nigeria, I think it didn't go too well. But overall, I think Ethiopian Airlines now has most of the African market
No,
share.
they have it on lock. And I think of all the brands that have the best room to grow and consolidate to world-class standards, which they've got some way to go to achieving,
So
I would bet on them for sure.
So it's an institution we're very proud of. But see, even they also sometimes really stifle innovation, and they also violate rules, specifically on payments. They do things that they're not supposed to do. And the national regulator, the National Bank of Ethiopia, is not going after them. And sometimes it's because the lack of capacity. Sometimes it's just a lack of, it's not their priority. But definitely also on that front, Ethiopian Airlines has been taking a lot of market share in terms of payments and doing things that they're not supposed to do. And for me, payment is very important because, financial services sector in general, because really like that's how you build an economy. It's really the backbone. If you look at every single economy in the world, literally the way it started is with financial services, banks, insurance companies, payments,
solving for commerce and efficiency in commerce.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
enabling
people
costs.
have these also fantasies around, oh, the banker is a thief and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, you need these institutions, and that's how you build an economy. And the minute you mess up with that backbone, that's it. The country is not going to grow in the way it's supposed to, or it's being going to be taken advantage of, basically.
Right, right.
So I think in hindsight, we're doing things the right way, but we're actually going through a major transformation right now in Ethiopia. So we'll see how we come out of it in the next, I would say, 1 or 2 years, because there's some major reforms that are happening right now, and it takes a bit of time, just like a bit like Argentina, right? It took about a year and a half to really see where they were headed,
Mhm.
and yeah, but in our case, the reforms are even are much deeper.
It's interesting you touch on Ethiopian Airlines. I remember the last time I attended Africa FinTech Summit when it was hosted. It wasn't last year. I think it was the year before. It was hosted in Zambia. There was someone who was deeply in the know about some very smart things that they've been doing for quite a while. I think the conversation was about practical AI applications in Africa. At the time, it was sort of like, is this even relevant to us? Can you believe that was the conversation at the
Hmm.
time? It was like, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, we see it's a big deal and we see people are hyping it up. But some people were like, this is just going to be like crypto. But to hone in on an observation you made, which coming from you, I think is quite interesting about how an institution like Ethiopian Airlines can, without suitable sort of oversight,
yeah,
overstep its dominance. It turns out, among other things, they are leading in deploying AI on pricing, and Safaricom, since their well headlined entry into Ethiopia, now alongside pretty much every mobile telco around the continent, having to contend with a satellite business coming to disrupt their financial models for long held dominance in mobile telephony. Have you looked into that and thought how
yeah,
ironic that a couple of years ago you were leading a lobby that was ensuring they weren't going to do
yeah,
an unhealthy
yeah.
clean sweep in your industry, whereas now they seem to be defending themselves from what appears to be potential
Yeah,
clean sweep from
a new
above.
paradigm. I mean, there's only one such service provider, so I think we can name it. It's Starlink, right?
That's
So I think
Starlink. Well,
with the
The
advent of
Chinese
Starlink,
have been warning that they're working on something. I mean,
yeah,
if Starlink's got something like I read somewhere 40,000 of these up in the air at the moment, can you imagine what
yeah,
China's about to do to to spray the
yeah,
air with
yeah.
theirs? Given your experience, I mean, how do you process these developments?
We said a moment ago that banks are really the backbone. The financial services sector is the backbone for the economy. Then, really, it's also the merchants that are really making the money circulate, go from one hand to another, etc. So, if these new technologies are going to enable these merchants to be more efficient, to get more revenue, for the households to get access to new type of information that is a good type of information, then it's all good, right? I think and I think both can, at least for a certain amount of time, can cohabitate and exist together, right?
Mm,
It doesn't have to be a or statement; it could be an and statement.
mm,
But for me, when it comes to, by the way, innovation on the continent, I think we have to be a bit also careful with that, because with I mean, local innovations, because sometimes we see all these new terms. It could be crypto AI, it could be and even the term entrepreneurship became at some point, and still to this day, very trendy
mm.
kind of thing. And so now you have a lot of people that are focusing on being an entrepreneur, and sometimes, for me, it's very funny, actually. Sometimes you see some of the development partners going all the way in the middle of maybe a jungle and trying to tell people in that jungle how to be an entrepreneur. And so sometimes it's becoming almost ridiculous.
It makes sense, Bernard.
And
It makes sense.
yeah, so innovation can disrupt, can bring about new things, but it can also make you lazy, because it's basically pushing you to not do the boring things, right?
Yeah.
And for me, payment, by the way, is boring. It's a boring thing. sometimes I see entrepreneurs like patting themselves on the back, say, wow, it's revolutionary. Actually, I used to tell the team, don't use those terms like we're coming up with a new revolution of like payments and no, we're not revolutionizing anything. We're just like making it happen. So the innovation is really the execution. It's not the product itself. And so I think sometimes some of our entrepreneurs on the continent are also making themselves a bit lazy to do the boring stuff.
Mhm.
It's a bit like, how can you do the fancy e-commerce and the fancy e-logistics company if
Without the road.
your highway has a bunch of potholes, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have bridges, right? So we need to do the boring stuff also as well,
Yeah, no, no, no. People just
and
want the Formula One Grand Prix before the
yeah,
before
yeah,
the
yeah.
potholes are addressed.
So we have to be careful with that. So that's why also like on the African continent, if all the brains are gone, right, who's going to build the continent, right? So really, really need people to come back physically or remotely and really build institutions, do the boring stuff, like building hospitals, building infrastructure, building the boring aspect also of technology. It could be like the core banking system of a bank. It could be in Ethiopia, we have the stock market. So building the new Bloomberg terminal for Ethiopia. So those things are maybe boring. It's like the backbone, but we need those things. And so we cannot always do like the fancy AI machine learning type of, yeah. So
Here I'm playing devil's advocate for someone listening. I'm like, that's rich coming from you, Bernard, joining this conversation from Tokyo. What's the big draw, and how is your being in Tokyo aiding the objectives you've laid out so far in this conversation?
On the African continent, sometimes we have to bring the party home, right? And that's what we're doing with our management consulting firm. We're really helping decision makers on the ground. We're helping different types of companies. It could be a large GAFA. It could be, a smaller company. It could be a growth start, local growth start. So we're helping those locally. But sometimes you also have to go where the party is happening and make yourself known. And look, I was at an event about, I think, 3 weeks ago now, something like that, where the topic of the conversation of the event, actually, there was a whole 1 day symposium, was about Africa, India, Japan, and how we need to grow investments between all these countries, etc. And it's funny because I looked around. So the event was starting, I believe, at 10 a.m. As you know, at 10 a.m. exactly, the event started because we're in Japan. So at 10:01, I started looking around and I checked who's really in the room. And there's a bunch of Japanese people. But remember, the topic is Japan, India,
And
Africa, right? So there's a few Indians running around, one or two fellow Africans, and that's pretty much it. And so people were talking about Africa and mentioning coming up with information and had data around Africa, different African countries, with no Africans in the room. And
Wow.
in the panel sessions, same thing. No panelists from Africa. I think just one remotely. But again, that reflects not on the host country, Japan, but it reflects on us. I mean, fine. Sometimes I know it's a bit difficult to get a visa, but you can make it happen if you're a bit aggressive with it. So in case that you didn't get a visa, then fine. That reflects on the Japanese government. But if you're able to get it, then it really reflects on you as an African. Why didn't you show up to that event?
Yeah.
And why aren't you trying to advocate for investments in Africa, be it in all kinds of different sectors? It could be technology, it could be things like the auto sector, a bunch of different. So, but they were talking about all kinds of things, including financial services, FMCG, and really, like, to answer your question, what we're really trying to do with the firm that we launched a couple of weeks ago here, that again is an extension of what we already do, but with a strong focus on Japanese organizations, is to first show up, to be in the backyard of these large Japanese organizations. In some cases, they're not that large, but still large compared to some of our institutions in Africa, to really help them get a sense of what's really happening on the ground in Africa, right? With data, with the intercultural management aspect, and also we bring them some experts from our network of experts. But we want to bring that to them being in their backyard. They shouldn't rely on World Bank data that they find on some kind of a, I don't know, you know, 10 like data type of
Which is
report
usually
that
2 or 3 years old anyway.
so yeah, or labor data that somehow they uncovered from somewhere in Geneva. I don't know, you know. So and that's what was happening that day. For instance, they only had, and again, I'm not pointing fingers at any of the present. They were doing a pretty good job. But the point is, the data that we have today readily available for our African economies, most of it is macro type of data and macroeconomic indicators, right?
And to
And
your
so
point, it's
if
not
you're
curated, thoughtfully
exactly,
curated
exactly,
for that
yeah,
audience.
and it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So we've partnered with Cassie Insight, who's been doing maybe you're aware of them, Andile, but they've been doing a tremendous
I
job.
am.
The president owner is Yannick, and
Yannick's
been
been
doing a
on this
tremendous
podcast
job.
many years ago.
Okay, there you go. So really like building a pipeline of data with consumer level data where you can get at the disaggregated level how a consumer is going to react in a specific region, specific, you know, tranche of age, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're a bank, let's say, and you're trying to expand to South Africa, now you have that data available. And so
Actionable
we want
intelligence.
to yeah, exactly. And you know, things move fast in this day and age, right? So we want to help them move fast, make decisions quickly, and we don't want to give them that, pardon my French, but that BS around, oh, you know, Africa, you need to navigate those things and you know, you need to bring patient capital and think long term. Investor doesn't want to think long term. You know, the guy can either invest on the stock market, whether it be there in Tokyo or in the US, and they have options. So if you tell them, oh, you need to think long term, that's not the right type of answer. So what we're trying to do with Encopa Lab is also really help them to build their confidence around the decisions that they want to make, whether they need to invest, whether it's a go or no go, right? Because in some cases, you don't want to spin your wheels for too long, but you decide after maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks of kind of DD due diligence on some, you know, specific deal that, you know, let's not do it.
What's the model then? Are you on retainer to help them make these discoveries, delivering these actionable insights? Are you incentivized by commissions on deal success? Are you an introducer for certain sort of pre-vetted opportunities? Are you all of the above?
Yeah.
What does delivering
Well,
on this day-to-day look like, Bernard?
we're not reinventing the wheel, right? So this is a pure management consulting play. Although, you know, management consulting is definitely also evolving with not just the advent of AI, but just the pure nature of information being now widely available. You know, about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when Accenture, Anderson at the time was around, you know, information was very limited. So people out of HBS, Harvard Business School, had to come up with some fancy acronyms, a quadrant on one, you know. But even in management consulting have evolved. But you know, in terms of the business model, we're not reinventing the wheel. So we can do time and material or fixed fee on a specific set of deliverables. We actually shy away from retainer because we feel like that's more PR model and those kinds of things. We want to be output oriented and really help the client based on results.
So you
So
want your incentives to be aligned and not be trying to justify why they shouldn't cancel.
exactly. Where we're pivoting a bit is that, again, management consulting is evolving and clients want advice now. They don't want it tomorrow. And they want it from an expert. They don't want it from a bunch of senior people and then a bunch of junior people. They just want it from some kind of really like
A vetted
person who's been
specialist,
there for really,
expert
25, 30 years, and they know the country, they know their verticals, and they want it now. So we have a network of experts who can deliver that type of advisory on different countries, but in different verticals. And obviously, Africa, we said it earlier, it's a bunch of different countries. And in 2025, we're really focusing on 6 countries, namely Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa.
And why
Yeah.
Japan? I mean, of all the places you could have,
Well,
what did
it's a
you
good
observe
question, right?
about this gap that I imagine exists pretty much everywhere?
When you look at the, I would say, multilateral, well, even like bilateral partnerships between Japan and African countries and Africa as a whole, it's been consistent. And when you look at TCAT, for instance, the Japanese are the ones who actually started this massive, and now we people make fun of the African leaders headed to Istanbul, or in some cases it's actually Baku, right? or Italy, Rome, etc., etc. Because I think last time they even went to Azerbaijan, no?
It was a random
But anyway,
place. It was a
yeah.
very
So,
random
but the Japanese started that 30 years ago. 30 years ago, TCAD started. It was the largest gathering of African leaders at the time, with a strong so-called Western economy, right? And I know Japan is not in the West, but they're usually part of the Western club. So they've been very consistent in not the amount and quantity of investments and FDI into the African continent, but in terms of the quality and nature. And I know it's a cliche, but it's actually true. Whatever they do, whether it be a manga or a katana or a management consulting engagement or salt. So pick your favorite
Heck, a
product
teddy
or
bear.
favorite service.
They could design a
They,
teddy bear, a pair of jeans, Bernard.
yeah,
They're going to bring a
they
certain
do it
level of
well.
craftsmanship and thoroughness that
Yeah,
is
they
pretty
they they
distinctive.
do it with their whole heart, and they do it well, and tomorrow they'll do it better. So there's no such thing as downgrading. Look at, for instance, Elon Musk. He's looking at the Chinese. They're coming up with a cheap model, let's say, I mean, we shouldn't call it cheap, but let's say a cheaper model, relatively speaking, for the Model 3. And now they recently announced, right? I think it was this week. They say, okay, we're going to do also a budget version. That's what they call it, a budget version. But see, a Japanese would never do that, for better or for worse, right? But the point is they don't do that. And so I think now going back now to about 30 minutes ago when we were talking about building institutions, etc., on the continent, I think their approach, maybe it's actually not good for them, right? To actually get more market share, because if they were like the Chinese and provide 5 different grades for the same product, then they would get more market share, right? But
in raw
turns out the
capitalist
Japanese,
sensibilities, it's limiting. It's a limiting outlook to approach
but
life that
for
way.
us, from a selfish standpoint, from really like building institutions standpoint in our African countries, I think it's a good thing, because working with them, we can really get some of that knowledge, some of that technology transferred to us. And the right and the good standard type of technology, the good type of knowledge. So I think there it's really a win-win. And remember how I was telling you that we need to show up? Well, not a lot of people are showing up. So we felt like there was a gap that we could fill. And so, yeah, this is something that we're doing. And there hasn't been that many actors helping Japanese organizations go on the continent. It's been mostly a JETRO play, and JETRO has its own limitations as well in terms of knowledge of local dynamics, in terms of access to data, and so on and so forth, right? So
I'm actually quite pleased then, given that breakdown, that you're out there repping us, as it were, and also pragmatically charting a course for what we might one day look back on as the early sort of treaty steps towards Africa's more confident and more collaborative and commercially viable, but also impactful relationship with Japan. You've definitely done your bit in making that stamp on Ethiopian fintech in the last decade, to your credit. And so I would certainly bet on you moving the needle in this area with and for us in Japan. Where is RFPay and how are things there, perhaps as a way to land this chopper? And what is your sense around investment in early stage tech opportunity, call it fintech or whatever else you're interested in at the moment?
You sounded like Arnold Schwarzenegger there for "Let's land that chopper."
Let's land that chopper.
But yeah, so look, I mean, Arifpe, I think actually the chopper took off, or the airplane took off, and I think it's fair to say that it's in cruise mode. But you actually want that cruise mode to be continuous takeoff as well, right? Because
you want the hockey
numbers,
stick. You want it to go to Mars.
Yeah, well, maybe not Mars, but the thing is, we broke even. We are now in that phase where we're issuing dividends to investors, which were a limited few. And yeah, I mean, it's been really a very rewarding journey, really, like personally, but also in terms of being the ability to build a team, and really like a high performing team. I really believe that, sometimes we look down on ourselves in Africa, but I think we can really build teams, not from like only a tech product standpoint, but really in terms of a corporate structure, we can really do that from scratch in a short amount of time. And this is possible also because we have really a youthful population, educated folks who are ready to, they're very thirsty. You come to Japan here and man, these guys, they've provided for their citizens, like seriously, like no other nation on earth in terms of health, education, etc., etc. Now, look at the Japanese though. They're not that thirsty. They're not that happy, right? We Africans were poor and everything, but we're happy for some reason. I don't know. We're happy, you know.
You can't stop us smiling, buddy.
Yeah. But for me, the happiness is besides the point. It's really the thirstiness of the youth for me that always like amazes me.
Like
you
the
know,
drive,
when
right?
you
Is that what you mean?
yeah,
Like
people exactly like you put I don't know Android platform, or it could it doesn't have to do with technology all the time, but something else. I mean, the guy will reverse engineer it for you and then explain it to you the next day. So because they're thirsty for knowledge, they'll go on YouTube, they'll figure it out. So that's the kind of youth that we're working with, and because they're really ready to do things, you can actually build institutions also very quickly. And it's actually counterintuitive, right? Because you think, oh, you know, in our legacy nations in the West, people are more, they have the ability to change and everything. No, not true. It's false. It's very difficult to change mindsets there and much easier to change mindsets so very, I think, rewarding on that front as well.
So you sound bullish. Would that be a fair assessment of your sentiment? Bullish
I think
on Africa, African talent, African startups?
And look, I think every nation has a PhD in conflict, but it's just that they moved on to conflict resolution, and then now they're enforcing and using their masters of engineering or whatever. But you look at France. I mean, you know, even 30 years ago, there was bombs exploding every other weekend.
That's true.
In Corsica or in Euskadi, like on the border with Spain, and so on and so forth. I mean, look at Greece, right? I mean, it was like third world country, man. Until
oh my word, Ireland, you know.
Oh yeah. So I think it's just we're going through cycles, and hopefully this next cycle is going to be one where it's going to be not just a straight line, but like that hockey stick, like you were saying, because we really have the youth that are really providing that tailwind, right? So yeah, everything is in our favor. We just need to do the right things.
Bernard Laurendeau. Did I get that nearly? Why am I even trying to force a French accent when I don't speak French? Bernard, it's been a real pleasure catching up with you, albeit from far away. May our paths cross again very, very soon. And we'll be pinging into you from time to time, if you don't mind, to pick up on how it's going. Congratulations on launching this new outfit out in Tokyo. You're our man in Japan. Let's put it that way. The village thanks you, and the village will be checking in from time to time to see how it's going. But we also do fully expect to see you in these streets on the continent, and look forward to it.
Definitely. Well, thanks again for having me on Delay. And yeah, definitely we'll meet again either in Africa or elsewhere.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.